They were told that surrender was worse than death, that the enemy would strip their honor, starve their bodies, and grind their souls into dust. For years they believed it because that was what every poster, every commander, every sermon had carved into their hearts. But when the train slowed and the steel doors groaned open in the middle of an American winter, the lesson they had carried all their lives began to tremble. The world outside was white, silent, mercilessly bright. Wisconsin, 1945. The wind cut through the threadbare uniforms of men who had once marched for an empire. Snow drifted through the cracks in the wooden station, catching on torn sleeves and cracked lips. Their boots crunched on the frozen ground, hollow sounds echoing between guard towers. No shouts, no strikes, no chaos, only order. Trucks moved in steady rhythm. Smoke rose from chimneys somewhere ahead, carrying the faint, unbelievable scent of cooking food. The men blinked through exhaustion, unsure if this calm was real or just another cruelty waiting to reveal its teeth. Among them, one soldier staggered, his ribs showing through the cloth, his eyes still searching for the face of an enemy he could hate. He had been trained to meet brutality with silence, to die standing if captured. Yet here, no one raised a hand. Guards watched rifles slung, faces unreadable. Every second stretched into eternity as fear turned into confusion. What kind of war was this, where the victors greeted the defeated, not with rage, but with rules? The air stung of cold iron and smoke, but beneath it lingered something more dangerous, a question forming quietly in the hearts of the prisoners. What if everything they were told about the enemy was a lie? What if mercy could wound deeper than bullets? The snow kept falling indifferent and endless as the men stepped into a world that would challenge everything they thought they knew about war and about themselves. The prisoners moved in a line through the snow, their breath hanging in the air like ghosts that refused to leave. The cold gnawed at their fingers, bit through their boots, and settled in their bones. None of them spoke. The sound of boots crunching in the frost was the only rhythm that existed, slow, steady, mechanical. Ahead, the gates of the camp loomed out of the whiteness tall fences, coiled with barbed wire that glinted like knives in the weak sunlight. For a moment, the men hesitated as if the ground before them marked the border between life and whatever came after. Guards stood at the entrance, rifles in their hands, faces unreadable. They didn't shout or curse, didn't shove the prisoners the way the Japanese military police had done to their own. They simply gestured, "Move this way, keep the line." Their voices were sharp, but not cruel, clipped in the rhythm of command. The men obeyed out of instinct, fear still holding them upright. One prisoner, barely more than a boy, clutched the torn sleeve of his comrade, whispering under his breath that this was where it would happen, that the Americans would humiliate them one by one. But the guards didn't laugh. They didn't strike. They simply counted heads, checked lists, and waved the line forward. Inside the wire, the world looked different from what they'd been told. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the snow smoke, curling from chimneys. Trucks rolled past their tires, grinding ice, carrying boxes stamped with English letters the prisoners couldn't read. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The air smelled not of blood or filth, but of wood, iron, and food. Food so rich, it made the stomachs of starving men tighten in pain. It was impossible to believe. They were herded into a yard where officers in American coats stood behind tables with papers. Translators, Japanese Americans in crisp uniforms, spoke in calm tones. The prisoners stared at them, bewildered, hearing their mother tongue spoken by men who wore the enemy's flag. The interpreters announced rules: no fighting, no stealing, no escape attempts. Those who obeyed would be fed and housed. Those who disobeyed would be punished according to regulation. Regulation, another word that sounded both terrifying and merciful. When their names were recorded, each man was searched. Their knives, belts, and personal belongings were taken and placed into bags marked with tags. One soldier tried to hide a photograph of his family in his boot, but when a guard found it, he didn't tear it up. He simply returned it, tucking it into the prisoner's breast pocket without a word. The gesture stunned the others more than any threat could have. No one could speak. They had prepared for violence, not for decency. Next came the delousing. The men were ordered to strip down their ragged uniforms, piled into bins to be burned. Steam hissed from metal pipes, and disinfectant filled the air with a sharp chemical sting. Naked and trembling, they stood shoulder to shoulder while American medics moved among them with clipboards and masks. The prisoners waited for mockery, for humiliation, but the medics barely spoke. They worked quickly, checking for lice, open wounds, frostbite. When one medic saw a man's infected leg, he called for help, knelt in the snow, and cleaned the wound himself. The prisoner flinched, expecting pain, but the touch was firm, professional. The medic tied the bandage and gave a nod, as if this small act required no gratitude. The man who'd been treated turned away his throat, tightening. Afterward, new clothes were issued, thick wool, coats, trousers marked with the letters P.W. for prisoner of war. The men slipped into them slowly, unsure if they were meant to be comforted or mocked. The fabric was coarse but warm, and for the first time in months, their bodies stopped shivering. They stood in silence, looking down at themselves, realizing how different they appeared. No longer soldiers of the emperor, not yet civilians, something in between. A whistle blew, cutting through the icy air. They were marched toward the barracks, long, narrow buildings lined with bunks and small stoves that glowed faintly in the dim light. The floorboards creaked under their feet, the warmth of the stoves touching their faces like something forbidden. They had slept in caves, in mud, under trees. Now they stood in a room that smelled of smoke and soap. One man reached out, pressed his palm to the wooden wall, and whispered, "It's real." Outside, a truck rumbled by carrying crates stamped with red crosses. The same symbol they had been told was Western propaganda now meant food, medicine, and rules that even victors followed. The paradox sank in slowly. How could the enemy care for those he had conquered? That night, when the camp lights went out, silence fell heavy. The wind moaned through the fences, rattling tin roofs, but inside the barracks, it was warm. Men lay on bunks staring at the ceiling, beams too stunned to sleep. Some still expected the cruelty to come at dawn. Others whispered that perhaps this kindness was a trick, a way to make them lower their guard before punishment began. But no one could deny the simple truth of the warmth, the blankets, the food that waited somewhere beyond those doors. In the darkness, one soldier's mind returned to the words his instructor had once shouted during training. "If you are captured, you cease to exist." Yet here he was, breathing warm, alive. He turned his face toward the stove and felt shame, not for capture, but for doubting what survival meant. At dawn, the camp awoke with the sound of a bugle. It startled them, a melody they had heard in their own army, now echoing in enemy hands. They dressed quickly, still wary. Guards opened the doors, voices firm but without anger, calling them to formation. Rows of men stood in the pale light, steam rising from their mouths as roll call began. The order was absolute, mechanical, but not violent. For soldiers who had lived through the chaos of collapsing fronts and jungle starvation, the rhythm of discipline felt almost merciful. Breakfast came next. They were marched to a large building that smelled of metal and cooking grease. Inside, the clatter of trays and the hiss of stoves filled the air. Prisoners moved in lines as cooks in white aprons ladled food onto their trays, oatmeal bread, something hot and real. The men hesitated, waiting for the sneer, for the blow, for the moment of degradation. It never came. "Move along," a guard said simply. They obeyed, sitting at long tables under dim lamps, the food steaming before them. As they ate, something unspoken passed between them. No one smiled, no one dared speak loudly, but their hands shook. For the first time since capture, they were not being starved. The warmth of the food spread through their chests like a betrayal and a relief at once. When the meal was over, they were marched outside again. Snow was still falling, soft and relentless. They began work assignments, some clearing paths, others hauling firewood or sweeping the mess hall floors. The guards watched closely, rifles slung, but they didn't interfere unless rules were broken. When a man slipped on the ice, a guard reached down and helped him to his feet without a word. That small act sent ripples through the line. By midday, exhaustion set in. Yet it was not the exhaustion of fear or hunger, it was the heaviness of realizing that the world no longer matched what they'd been taught. Every rule they had lived by, every command drilled into them had been built on an image of an enemy that no longer fit. The Americans were strong, disciplined, even proud, but not cruel. That night, when the lights dimmed again, murmurs spread across the barracks. "They treat us like men," one voice said softly. "Maybe too well." Another answered bitterly, "It's a trick. They fatten us before they send us home as weaklings." But no one truly believed that anymore. Deep down, fear had begun to change shape. It was no longer fear of death, it was fear of understanding. Lying in the dark, the soldier who had once clung to the photograph of his family stared at the ceiling and wondered how he would explain this when the war was over. How would he tell his son that the enemy had shown mercy, that the world was not as simple as the flags they had fought for? He closed his eyes, hearing the faint hum of wind beyond the wire, and realized that the war inside his mind had only just begun. Beyond the fences, the snow kept falling, white, endless, and silent, covering every footprint, every lie, every expectation that had brought them here. The camp slept beneath a sky of cold stars, and within it, 100 hearts beat quietly, torn between pride and the unbearable weight of grace. The morning began like any other, gray and sharp as broken glass. The prisoners woke to the sound of boots on the wooden floor, orders barked in English, and the clatter of metal trays being stacked outside. They moved slowly, still unsure how to behave in a place that hadn't yet punished them. The warmth of the previous night still lingered in their bones, but suspicion was stronger than comfort. Every gesture from the guards, every silence felt loaded with meaning. Somewhere in their minds, they still waited for the cruelty they had been promised. Kindness, they told themselves, was only a mask before the blade. They lined up outside the barracks, breath steaming into the cold morning air. The sky above was pale, the kind of color that makes even sunlight feel exhausted. Across the yard, a bell rang clear and metallic. Guards motioned for the line to move toward the mess hall. The smell reached them before the sight: smoke, oil, something thick and foreign, something that didn't belong in war. It wound through the cold like an invitation and a warning at once. Some men swallowed hard, their empty stomachs betraying them with quiet growls. Others tried to look away, eyes fixed on the snow, as if ignoring hunger could preserve a shred of dignity. Inside, the noise was unlike anything they had known in months. Trays clattered, voices shouted over the hiss of stoves. The air was heavy with grease and steam. The men shuffled forward in a slow, hesitant rhythm, 10 trays trembling in their hands. At the front of the line, American cooks moved with practiced ease, dropping food onto plates, ladling soup, sliding bread across counters. No one spat at them. No one jeered. The guard spoke little, just the same word repeated again and again: move. When the first prisoner reached the counter, an American soldier looked up briefly, then set a ladle of thick stew on his tray, chunks of potato carrot meat glistening with fat. He added a slice of bread and, after a pause, a small tin cup of coffee. The prisoner stood frozen, unable to move. The cook frowned. "Go on," he said, motioning with the ladle. The man obeyed his steps, uncertain, as if each one might trigger the blow that still hadn't come. Behind him, the next prisoner received the same portion, then another, and another. No scraps, no insults, no delay. Just food, real food steaming in the cold air. At the tables, the men sat in silence. No one spoke. The steam rose between them, like a curtain hiding their faces. They stared down at the trays, at the impossible generosity laid before them. One man lifted the bread and sniffed it, half expecting the sour scent of rot. It smelled of warmth and salt. Another took a sip of coffee, flinching at the bitterness. It burned his tongue, but he didn't stop. Around him, spoons began to clink softly against metal. The sound was hesitant at first, then steady, a rhythm of disbelief turning into hunger. For the first time since capture, there was color in their faces. Fat and salt returned to their mouths like forgotten languages. The stew was simple, but to men who had eaten weeds and roots, it tasted like memory itself. One prisoner closed his eyes as he chewed, letting the warmth spread through his chest. Another set his spoon down, trembling. He whispered to the man beside him, "It's a trick. They want us to think they're merciful." His friend didn't answer. He just kept eating each mouthful slower than the last, as if afraid it would disappear. The guards watched from the edges of the room. They didn't interfere, didn't speak, didn't smile. They just stood, rifles resting on their shoulders, the faint smell of tobacco hanging in the air. Their silence felt heavier than any threat. Were they observing or protecting? The prisoners couldn't tell. After the meal, they were ordered to leave the trays and stand in formation. The men moved like sleepwalkers, dazed by what they had just experienced. Outside, the cold hit them again, sharper now after the warmth. One soldier wiped his mouth and found grease on his fingers. He stared at it, the sheen of fat glistening in the sunlight. For a moment, it felt obscene, a luxury that shouldn't exist in war. He rubbed it away quickly, as if ashamed of having touched something human. That afternoon, work assignments began. Some prisoners shoveled snow from the roads, others chopped wood. The tasks were dull but manageable. No one was beaten for moving too slowly. No one shouted threats. The guards gave instructions, sometimes through gestures, sometimes through interpreters. When one elderly man collapsed in the snow, clutching his side, a young guard approached. The prisoners froze, expecting the blow. Instead, the guard knelt down, helped the man sit up, and handed him a canteen. The water was cold, but the act burned hotter than fire. The old man stared, lips trembling, unable to speak. When the guard walked away, leaving him to recover, the others said nothing. But the silence carried a new weight. That night, the mess hall offered something even stranger: meat and a small bottle of dark liquid with white letters curling across the glass. The prisoners examined it with suspicion. One shook it, hearing the fizz inside. "Poison," someone muttered. "They'll finish us this way." But when the first man dared to drink, the hiss and sweetness of the soda stunned him. He coughed, eyes watering the taste, exploding across his tongue like fireworks. A moment later, laughter burst out raw, startled, uncontrollable. It spread hesitant at first, then freer. Men who had forgotten how to laugh found themselves choking on it. The guards glanced over but didn't intervene. To them it was nothing. To the prisoners, it was impossible. Sweetness in captivity, sugar in a place meant for surrender. Some wept quietly, hiding their faces in their sleeves. Others chewed their meat slowly, savoring the grease, their tears mixing with the salt. They had been told that the enemy would torture them, starve them, crush them. Instead, the enemy had fed them like men. Later, back in the barracks, the arguments began. "They're softening us," one said. "They want us to forget Japan." Another replied, "Maybe they don't need to hurt us. Maybe this is how they win." A third voice whispered, "If kindness is a weapon, then I don't know how to defend against it." The room fell quiet. Outside, snow tapped softly against the window panes. As the night deepened, the man who had tasted soda for the first time lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He could still feel the bubbles on his tongue, the sweetness lingering like a memory he didn't own. He thought of his home village, of his mother boiling rice with salt because there was nothing else left. He thought of the boys who had died beside him, hollow and dry-mouthed, whispering the emperor's name before the darkness took them. And now, here he was, alive, fed clean, his hunger silenced by the hands of those he had been told were monsters. The confusion was unbearable. Gratitude felt like betrayal. Every swallow of food, every gesture of mercy, cut deeper than hunger ever had. He turned to the man in the next bunk and whispered, "Why are they doing this?" The answer came back soft as snow, "Maybe because they can." He didn't sleep for a long time. The stove glowed faintly in the corner, throwing soft light across the wooden walls. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, an American guard hummed a tune slow and careless. It drifted through the night like a lullaby, haunting in its gentleness. The prisoner closed his eyes, trying to summon anger, but none came. Only a strange hollow ache remained, a feeling too complicated to name. By morning, the memory of that meal had already begun to spread through the camp, like rumor, like infection. Men whispered about it in the work lines, in the washrooms, in the quiet hours, before lights out. Some swore it was part of a plan. Others said nothing, afraid that speaking of it would make it less real. But in every heart, the same thought took root, that the enemy was capable of mercy. And for soldiers raised to die rather than doubt, that was the most dangerous truth of all. Days turned into weeks, and the camp began to breathe with its own rhythm, a rhythm that no longer came from the front lines or the crack of gunfire, but from the daily routines of men learning how to live inside fences. At first, it was the structure that defined them. Roll call at dawn, work assignments by mid-morning meals, at fixed hours, curfew at night. The discipline was strict, almost mechanical, yet it carried none of the brutality they had feared. What unsettled the prisoners was not punishment, but order. Order that functioned without cruelty, rules enforced without rage. They had been taught that only the strong could control the weak through pain. Here, power moved in silence, and it was that silence that began to erode everything they thought they knew. Every man found his task. Some shoveled snow from the narrow camp roads, their shovels scraping against the frozen ground in an endless metallic rhythm. Others worked in the laundry, pressing uniforms until steam clouded the windows. A few were sent outside under guard to help on nearby farms, where they saw barns filled with grain tractors gleaming like steel beasts, and American children chasing chickens through fields untouched by war. That sight cut deeper than any wound. For the men who had watched their homeland burn, the abundance of the enemy was unbearable. Still, the camp was not without its small mercies. The Red Cross came regularly inspecting conditions, ensuring rations were fair. Prisoners received thin envelopes of pay coupons that could be used at the canteen. The canteen itself was a strange world, shelves stacked with cigarettes, chocolate bars, soap, writing paper, and even small radios behind glass. The first time they saw it, they laughed bitterly. It felt like an insult, a mockery of the hunger still gnawing at Japan. Yet some couldn't resist. A man who had once fought on Saipan stood before the counter trembling as he exchanged his coupons for a bar of chocolate. He unwrapped it, slowly broke off a piece, and placed it in his mouth. The sweetness made his eyes sting. In Japan, he murmured to his friend, "This is medicine." His voice cracked on the last word. Inside the barracks, conversations began to shift. At first, the men spoke only of home villages, families, the taste of rice. But as days passed, talk turned to the present, the guards, the food, the strange fairness of their captors. Some prisoners began to learn simple English words. The American teachers came twice a week writing on chalkboards, while the men repeated after them, awkward and slow. Bread table window, thank you. Laughter sometimes broke the tension, softening the edges of shame. Yet not everyone joined. To some, learning the enemy's language was the ultimate disgrace. Each word you speak, one man hissed, is a step away from who we are. Division spread quietly through the camp. There were those who clung to the old code, the imperial soldiers who still saluted invisible officers who prayed in silence for victory. And there were those who had begun to question everything, who felt their faith in that code crumbling with each meal, each act of mercy. In the evenings, arguments would erupt between bunks. "You speak like an American," one accused. "You bow to their kindness." The other shot back, "At least I live to bow." Fists clenched, but blows rarely fell. The anger was too deep, too exhausted to find its way into violence. One night after lights out, a whisper passed through the barracks, a rumor that the Americans were showing films in one of the recreation halls. A handful of prisoners volunteered for cleanup duty there the next day, curious. When they arrived, they saw the impossible rows of wooden chairs, a white sheet pinned against a wall, and a projector humming softly. The Americans sat beside them, watching in silence as light flickered across faces. The film showed men and women dancing in bright clothes, music filling the air. It wasn't propaganda or mockery. It was life, ordinary life, untouched by destruction. One prisoner stared at the screen until tears blurred his vision. He thought of Tokyo burning of his sister's house, reduced to ash. When the lights came up, he turned away so the guards wouldn't see his face. There were moments when hatred tried to return, when memory bit back. During work on a nearby farm, an American farmer shouted at them for moving too slowly. His son, barely older than a boy, stood behind him with crossed arms, eyes full of resentment. Later, one of the guards explained quietly that the farmer's son had died in the Pacific. The words hung in the cold air. None of the prisoners spoke. They understood loss too well to answer. Sometimes kindness came from the smallest, most unexpected places. During one bitter afternoon, as snow began to fall again, a young American guard named Miller approached a group of prisoners repairing a fence. He carried photographs in his pocket and without words showed them his mother, his father, two small sisters smiling before a white house. The prisoners gathered around staring at the images. They couldn't understand his words, but they understood what he meant. One of them, a thin man from Hiroshima, drew shapes in the snow, a house, a tree, a woman holding a child. Miller smiled and nodded. It wasn't conversation, but it was something more real than language. But not all hearts softened. Some prisoners grew more defiant in their silence, clinging to the only thing left untouched, their pride. They mocked those who laughed with guards, who practiced English, who smiled when offered cigarettes. "You have forgotten Japan," they said. "You have forgotten your duty." The accused men said nothing because they couldn't explain what they themselves didn't yet understand, that the boundaries of loyalty had begun to blur. That honor, once so clear, now felt like a shadow. The tension reached a quiet breaking point one night. Two prisoners began arguing after lights out. One accused the other of betrayal of bowing too deeply to an American officer. The insult echoed through the barracks like a gunshot. The accused stood, his hands trembling, his voice rising. "I bow because I'm alive," he shouted. "Would you rather I die for a flag that cannot feed its people?" Silence followed, thick and electric. Even the guards outside seemed to hesitate. In that silence, everyone realized that something irreversible had been spoken. After that night, conversations changed. The men still prayed, still sang the songs of home in whispers, but the sharp edge of fanaticism dulled. They began to share what they had learned from the Americans, how to write simple words, how to fix a generator, how to fold a blanket square. They didn't call it learning, they called it surviving. But in truth, it was adaptation, the most dangerous form of resistance. As spring approached, the snow melted, revealing patches of brown earth around the camp. The fences still stood, the towers still watched, but life inside felt different. The men began planting small gardens beside the barracks, tiny patches of green that reminded them of home. Some guards even brought seeds, saying nothing as they handed them through the wire. A few prisoners began to hum, while they worked soft melodies that mingled with the wind. For the first time since their capture, laughter sounded without guilt, yet peace came with its own pain. Letters arrived from Japan, thin and trembling with bad news. Cities gone, families displaced, children starving. The guilt was suffocating. The same men who once cursed the Americans now sat in silence, their hands shaking as they held the paper. "We eat while they die," one whispered. No one answered, because no answer could erase that truth. That night, the soldier who had once tasted chocolate sat by the stove watching the fire burn low. "We thought war would make us heroes," he said quietly, "but it only made us hungry." The man beside him nodded, eyes on the flames. "And now, kindness makes us weak." They said nothing more after that, but both knew it wasn't true. Kindness hadn't made them weak. It had made them human again, and that was far harder to bear. Outside, the wind swept through the barbed wire, humming like a low voice that never stopped. The guards in their towers shifted, stamping their feet against the cold. Inside, the prisoners turned in their bunks, caught between sleep and memory, between pride and gratitude. The war beyond the wire raged on, but inside those fences, another war was being fought, one without guns or flags. A war between what they had been taught to hate and what they were beginning to understand. In the stillness before dawn, as frost crept along the windows, one man whispered to no one, "If the enemy can show mercy, then what does that make us?" The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered, unbearable and true. Spring crept into the camp like a whisper that no one trusted. The snow melted, slowly revealing the brown scars of earth underneath, and with it came the faintest rumor of hope. The prisoners worked in lighter coats, now their breaths no longer clouds in the air. They planted small gardens near the barracks, thin rows of cabbage and beans that seemed fragile but alive. For many, those green shoots became symbols of something they couldn't name, something like survival. The Americans allowed it, even gave them tools and seeds. Some guards watched quietly as the men worked, and though no words passed between them, the gesture was enough to make the heart stir uneasily. Hope in captivity was a dangerous thing. Rumors began to move through the camp like wind, rumors of Japan's struggle, of bombings, of the emperor's armies retreating across islands whose names were once shouted in victory. At first, no one believed it. Pride refused to bend. "It's American lies," some said. "They want to break our will." Others stayed silent, their hands shaking slightly as they tied bootlaces or shoveled dirt. In their eyes flickered something that looked less like disbelief and more like fear. One morning, the guards handed out envelopes, thin, crumpled, marked with Japanese characters. Letters from home. The news inside them struck harder than any bullet could. Cities gone, villages burned, families scattered or dead. The letters spoke of hunger so deep that people boiled tree bark for food. Mothers sold heirlooms for a handful of rice. Children wasted away their bones, pressing against skin like ghosts that refused to leave. A man named Sato sat on his bunk, clutching his letters so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His wife's handwriting was barely legible, each word slanted with exhaustion. "The house is gone," she wrote. "The garden destroyed. Our son is thin. He asks for you at night, but I tell him you are serving the emperor. He believes it, though he is too weak to bow now." Sato read those words again and again until the paper blurred from tears. He hadn't cried when captured, not when his friends were buried in the Pacific mud. But now his chest ached with something far worse than grief-shame. He had eaten that morning. His hands were warm, his belly was full, his son was starving. Around him, other men reacted the same way. Some fell silent, some cursed under their breath. One man tore his letter apart, scattering it like ash across the floor. Lies he spat, though his voice broke. Another whispered, "If this is what our empire has become, then what was all this for?" That afternoon, the camp was quieter than it had ever been. Even the guards seemed subdued, their boots softer on the frozen paths. The prisoners walked with their heads low, eyes on the ground, each lost in a private storm of memory. The canteen, once alive with murmured conversation, sat half empty. Chocolate bars remained untouched on the shelves. Food had turned into a curse. Every bite reminded them of the mouths that had none. When the Red Cross truck arrived the next day, bringing newspapers for the camp library, a few men crowded around the interpreter to ask for translations. He hesitated, then began to read. The words were simple but merciless. Tokyo burns. Osaka in ruins. Children fleeing to the countryside. Civilians digging through rubble. The headline spoke of defeat, but what silenced the crowd was the mention of a new weapon, something unleashed upon Hiroshima. A single bomb, they said, that had erased an entire city. Hiroshima? For one man in the group, that word hollowed the air. He stumbled backward, his face drained of color. He had drawn that name in the snow months earlier, showing it to the American guard named Miller. It was his home. His parents, his sisters, they had been there. Now the word lived only as ruin. He asked the interpreter to repeat it, but the man's voice faltered. Hiroshima is gone. The prisoner sank to his knees, hands in his hair, his breath shattering into gasps that didn't sound human. No one touched him. No one could. That night, the barracks were silent except for the sound of the wind. The stove flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows on the wooden walls. Men lay awake, staring at the ceiling, afraid of their own thoughts. Sato sat by the window, reading his letter again by the dying light, lips moving as if in prayer. Our son is thin. The words burned holes through him. He whispered into the dark. Why am I warm when he is cold? Why do I live when he starves? No answer came, only the distant creak of the guard tower and the low hum of an American truck somewhere beyond the wire. The next morning during work, detail something broke. One of the prisoners refused his ration of bread. He placed it carefully on the table and said in Japanese, "Give it to someone who needs it." When the interpreter translated this to the guard, the young American frowned. "There's no one else here who needs it," he said. The prisoner didn't answer. He just walked away. That small act rippled through the camp. By evening, several others followed. They skipped meals, worked longer hours, trying in their own quiet way to share the pain they could not erase. Yet guilt is a disease that doesn't heal through suffering. It only deepens. The more they tried to deny comfort, the more unbearable it became to accept kindness. A man whispered one night, "I used to think the worst thing was to die for the emperor. Now I think it's to live and see what dying was for." His words hung in the air, too heavy to challenge. The guards noticed the change too. They spoke less, lingered less. Some avoided eye contact altogether, as if the prisoner's grief had infected them. One evening, Miller, the same guard who had shown his family photos, approached the man from Hiroshima. He didn't say anything, just set a small folded photograph on the bunk, a picture of a city skyline under sunlight. It wasn't much, but the gesture meant something wordless. "I cannot rebuild what's gone, but I can remember with you." The prisoner looked at the photo for a long time before nodding, once eyes shining with unshed tears. Days later, a radio crackled in the mess hall. The interpreter stood by it, translating the announcement that Japan had surrendered. The words seemed to fall into a void too large to comprehend. Some men froze, others bowed their heads, a few whispered prayers. No one cheered, no one wept. They were soldiers without a country, now bound not by orders, but by silence. One man muttered, "The emperor has spoken. We are to lay down arms." Another answered, "We already have." That night, despair and relief wrestled in every heart. For years, they had been told death was honorable, defeat unthinkable. Now defeat was all that remained, and somehow it carried both mercy and humiliation. They had survived, but at a cost that left them hollow. The camp lights dimmed and the world outside was ending, but inside, something else began a reckoning that no nation could order or erase. Sato dreamed of his son that night. In the dream, the boy stood barefoot in a burned field, holding out an empty bowl. "Are you proud of me, father?" he asked. Sato tried to answer, but no sound came. He woke with a cry, the sound strangled in his throat. The other men stirred, but said nothing. They knew that cry too well. It was the sound of men remembering what they had lost. The next day, the Americans treated them no differently. Roll call, breakfast work, everything continued as before. That was the cruelest mercy of all. The guards neither celebrated nor mocked. They followed the same rules, the same schedules, as if nothing had changed. To the prisoners, it felt like walking through the ruins of a dream while pretending it still stood. By dusk, the camp seemed smaller, the fences closer, the air heavier. The men sat in silence, watching the sun sink behind the hills. For the first time, they didn't look toward the horizon with longing. There was nothing left to return to, and yet the idea of home haunted them more than ever. In that fading light, one prisoner whispered, "We fought to protect Japan, but Japan no longer exists." Another answered quietly, "Then maybe now we fight to protect what's left of us." And as night fell over the camp, the wind carried a faint, bitter scent of smoke, distant, unseen, but unmistakable. It smelled like memory, like guilt, like the ashes of everything they had once believed could never burn. When the announcement of surrender reached the camp, the world did not explode into chaos or celebration. It simply went quiet. The guards did not shout, the prisoners did not cheer. A heavy, wordless stillness fell over everything, as if sound itself had died with the war. The men stood in the yard, their breath rising in thin clouds, the American flag fluttering faintly above the headquarters. They had expected the end of the world to come with thunder. Instead, it came with order. For the first time, the word peace felt heavier than war. Days passed in a blur of silence and routine. The guards still called roll, the cooks still served meals, the trucks still came and went, but something had shifted. The men no longer marched like soldiers, they moved like survivors, their eyes unfocused, their thoughts drifting somewhere beyond the fences. At night, the camp lights glowed across the barbed wire, and they would sit by their bunks staring at the yellow bulbs, as if waiting for meaning to appear out of the hum. The empire they had been willing to die for was gone, yet their hearts had not caught up to that truth. Repatriation orders came in the early days of autumn. Red Cross officials arrived again, clipboards in hand, speaking in quiet tones. The prisoners were weighed, examined, issued new uniforms for the journey home. The Americans handed out kits with soap razors and blankets. Some of the men refused the gifts at first, too proud or too broken to accept them. Others took them silently, understanding that this was not charity but closure. Their names were read aloud in groups. Trucks waited at the gates, engines running, ready to carry them to the trains that would take them to the coast. When the gates finally opened, many could not move. They stood staring at the wire that had confined them for so long, unsure whether they were leaving a prison or stepping into another kind of captivity, the captivity of what waited in Japan. The guards saluted them as they passed. No hatred, no mockery, just the strange level gaze of men who had seen too much. One young American guard, the one named Miller, caught sight of the man from Hiroshima. Without a word, he extended his hand. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the Japanese prisoner took it, bowing his head slightly. It was not forgiveness, not even friendship. It was recognition. The smallest bridge between enemies who had learned that mercy could wound deeper than violence. The journey home took weeks. The sea was calm, but inside the ship, the air was thick with unease. The men gathered in small groups on deck, staring at the horizon. They tried to imagine what awaited them, the ruins, the silence, the judgment of those who had never been captured. In the distance, the coastline of Japan emerged like a shadow through mist. As the ship drew closer, the smell of ash drifted over the water. It smelled of earth and sorrow. When they disembarked, the sight struck them like a physical blow. Cities flattened, bridges twisted, fields barren. People moved through the rubble like ghosts wrapped in rags, their faces hollow and gray. Mothers carried children with eyes too old for their age. The prisoners, no, the repatriated soldiers, walked through this devastation with a sense of unreality. They had expected ruin, but not this kind of silence, not this complete erasure of what home had once meant. Sato found what was left of his village days later. The house was gone, replaced by a crater where the garden had been. He found his wife in a refugee camp outside the city, thinner than he remembered, her eyes dim but alive. When she saw him, she didn't smile. She only reached out and touched his face, tracing the lines of a man who had survived the unthinkable. Behind her, their son stood barefoot, clutching a bowl that was too large for his hands. "You lived," she whispered. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't forgiveness either. That night, sitting beside the small fire in the camp, Sato listened to the wind move through the wreckage. He told his wife nothing of the Hamburgers or the Coca-Cola, nothing of the guard who had shown him pictures of his family, nothing of the kindness that had kept him alive. How could he? In a land where people starved and begged for rice, such stories would sound obscene. Yet the memories haunted him, the taste of warmth, the look in an enemy's eyes when offering bread. He realized that he carried two kinds of hunger now, one for what Japan had lost and one for what it had taught him to deny the possibility that compassion could exist even in war. In the months that followed, the repatriated men tried to rebuild their lives, but society met them with suspicion. Cowards, some whispered, men who surrendered while others burned. Shame became another kind of prison. The men avoided each other in the streets, afraid of being recognized. When they did meet, their conversations were brief, guarded. Yet, in those rare exchanges, they shared the same haunted look, the look of men who had lived long enough to question everything. One evening, Sato visited a small shrine built from the ruins of his old village. The wood smelled of smoke and salt. He knelt before the altar, his son beside him, and placed a small offering of rice. The boy asked softly, "Father, did the Americans hurt you?" The question caught Sato off guard. He looked at his son's thin face, at the hope still flickering behind tired eyes. After a long silence, he answered, "No, they fed me." The boy frowned, confused. "But they were the enemy." Sato nodded slowly. "Yes, and that is what I cannot forget." He didn't explain further. How could he explain that kindness when given by an enemy was harder to bear than hatred, that mercy had stripped him bare, revealing the thin line between pride and humanity? In that moment, Sato understood that the war had not ended. It had only moved inside him. Years later, long after the ashes of the cities had cooled, an American journalist visited Japan to interview former prisoners of war. Sato was among them, his hair gray, his hands scarred from labor. When asked about his time in captivity, he paused for a long moment before answering. "We were treated with fairness," he said finally, "better than we believed we deserved." The journalist asked if he forgave his captors. Sato shook his head. "There's nothing to forgive," he replied. "War taught us all the same thing, that cruelty is easy, but kindness stays." After the interview, he walked through the narrow streets of his rebuilt village. Children played in the dirt, their laughter rising into the dusk. The air smelled faintly of miso and smoke, familiar and alive. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not the peace of victory or surrender, but the fragile peace of understanding. He looked up at the sky where the first stars had begun to appear and thought of the men he had left behind, the guards, the fellow prisoners, the faces lost to time. He wondered if they remembered too, if somewhere across the ocean another man was thinking of that day when an enemy offered him food instead of a bullet. As he turned toward home, his son ran ahead, laughing, his footsteps light against the earth. Sato watched him go, a small figure disappearing into the glow of lanterns, and felt the past loosen its grip just a little. The war would never leave him, but it had given him one truth he would carry until his last breath, that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can flicker like a candle and refuse to die. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "Cruelty, you can fight. Kindness, you remember." And with that, he stepped into the night, not as a soldier, not as a captive, but as a man who had finally learned what it meant to be free.